Great to see everyone here. So just to make sure you are in the right session, this is one of the two sessions that are running in parallel. This is a session called Better Than a Pill, and hopefully colleagues are in the right room. So my name's Paul Burstow, and I've been involved with the Healthy Aging Programme as one of the advisory board members over the last few years. It's been a real delight to be involved in the programme, seeing it sort of from its inception through to translating a number of the programs into things that are really delivering and making a difference for people on the ground, and really increasing our levels of knowledge and insight as well. And today we're, in this session, going to be focusing on things that can make a difference to address some of the real social drivers, some of those social determinants of poor health, some of the things that can help create better health as well. And I think we all know that good health begins where we live, what we learn, where we work, how we play, about good quality of the housing we're living in, about quality of schools, access to jobs, the neighbourhoods, the safety of the neighbourhoods we're living in, and so on. And as we heard in the presentation from Chris Whitty just now, there's marked differences in terms of how people experience health, and a very marked difference in terms of the biological age of people depending on the areas of deprivation in which they are living. Being the most deprived, having almost like a 25-year age difference to those living in the least deprived areas. And that really is a marked sort of area of challenge, it seems to me, in terms of what we can do beyond just a biomedical approach, but actually looking at the wider social determinants. And when you realise that the NHS accounts for probably 20% of a person's health status, and the rest is a whole range of other factors, it really does underline why we need to take a wider and different approach, why there are interventions that are better than a pill. But every day, about 1.48 million of us have a GP appointment. 1.48 million appointments every day. And it's thought that around 1 in 5 GP consultations are for primarily social reasons. And that's where social prescribing has a really significant part to play. And in this session, we're going to be exploring social prescribing as an approach that offers an alternative to medical treatments by connecting people to activities, groups, services in their communities to meet the practical, social and emotional needs that affect their health and well-being. And this session is going to explore the challenges faced by innovators in developing new services and how they can make a case for investment. And I'm really pleased that I'm not the one that's going to be now answering that question and talking about it, because we have a fantastic panel who are going to talk through the issues briefly, and then we're going to open up to questions. And I've got to mention a couple of things, really. One is, please do start, as this session proceeds, to think about what questions you might want to put into Slido, and start typing questions into Slido. It'd be great to have your questions. And not just those of you who are in the room, but those that you are watching this through live streaming. And secondly, we want to put a quick question up now, just to get a sense of who's in the room. So hopefully, by the magic of Slido and those that are going to operate this, a question will now appear on the screen to give you an idea, because we want to get a sense of who's here to contribute to this session. So I'm just looking to see if anything's appearing on the screen, and it isn't.
It is now.
Oh, it is now. Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, well, whilst that's just going through, I'm just going to introduce our 4 panelists. Our first panelist is Charlotte Osborne-Ford, who is the CEO of the National Academy for Social Prescribing. They're a charity funded by the Department of Health and Social Care to advance social prescribing, and we'll hear more from Charlotte in a moment. Our second speaker is Giles Wilmore, and he is the CEO of Music in Mind Remote Limited, which was established as a joint venture by the award-winning orchestral charity Manchester Camerata and the University of Manchester. And again, we'll hear more from Giles in a minute, and some of you, I'm sure, will have been to the breakout sessions that have been going on where there's been an opportunity to take part in music therapy during the day. Our third speaker is Siobhan Casey, and she's the Director of Marketing and Business Development at Age Northern Ireland, and is a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Equity and Brain Health at the Global Brain Health Institute. And then finally, Katie Nex. Katie is a Director for Health and Social Care and the lead for end-of-life care at Social Finance. And Katie leads on the development portfolio for health and social care, focused on social investments at, as I say, Social Finance. So those are our 4 panelists. And just looking at the results, I think it's still tweaking ever so slightly, but we have a great representation of research colleagues. We have a number of service providers. We're really interested to get your perspectives as well. And we have a large number of others, which is always a helpful category because it tells you absolutely nothing. But it's useful to know we have 30% of you are others, and we have 3% of commissioners. I think we're interested to hear from commissioners in this conversation about what has encouraged you to play a part in stimulating the opportunities for social prescribing to actually have things to prescribe, and what you're doing to help build that market or that supply of relative things. So I'm going to hand over now to Charlotte to give us an introduction. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you. Really pleased to be here today. So I want to start by just saying that if we try to understand the context for investment into social prescribing, which is really the purpose of this session, the first thing we have to do is understand the policy context for social prescribing, which has changed rapidly over the last 5 years. So social prescribing has gone on in lots of different formats for decades, but in 2019 it was enshrined in government and NHS policy, and there was significant government investment in the hundreds of millions of pounds into social prescribing. But that was into a very specific element. So in NHS policy, social prescribing is part of personalised care. And what it means is understanding a patient or a person's whole lifestyle, listening to them, giving them time, having a really holistic assessment of their needs and understanding their goals and motivations, and then building their confidence, building their aspiration, and building their motivation to help them access things. So in that framing, all of the investment to social prescribing went to the workforce to be able to deliver this. And that workforce, they're known as social prescribing link workers. They're within primary care. So the workforce is about supporting the patient to understand what they could benefit from. And all of the investment has gone there, but there's an assumption that what the person will then be referred on to already exists and is already in the community. And this has been the real problem, that actually what we know is that both statutory services and voluntary sector services and community services are really struggling. They've been struggling over the last few years, but more so than ever. There's underinvestment. You may have seen in the NCVO report published just this week that said that large numbers of charities and voluntary groups that are delivering services, and services often funded by the NHS and local authorities, are under extreme pressure and actually subsidising those services through charitable income and grants and donations. So what we found is, although there has been this investment, it's gone into the workforce, there hasn't been comparable investment into the communities and services that people could benefit from. So at the National Academy for Social Prescribing, this is a key area of our work, to look at how we can bring investors, public sector, private sector, philanthropists together to have a more collaborative approach and really start to target their investment where population health data, health inequality data, the sorts of data that Professor Chris Whitty shared so wonderfully, how can we target their investment into those areas of most need and to where the referrals through social prescribing are going to. So we know more than 2 million people have accessed social prescribing link workers in primary care and then been referred out to community groups. So there is a huge increased demand. And looking at these new models of investment is the next step on the social prescribing journey.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. Over to you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to George and the organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. As Paul said, I'm from an organisation called Music in Mind Remote. With our sister organisation, Manchester Camerata, we provide music-based therapy for people living with dementia in care homes and community settings in a number of locations across Greater Manchester. We're looking to expand further than that and spread our model to other parts of the country. I've had a great conversation with a number of people about this, but do come and chat afterwards if you're interested. And we have one more session upstairs in the Graham Thought Room after this if you want to join us and experience it live. It's evidence-based. We all know that music therapy can help emotional connection, creativity, memory, reduced agitation. Our partnership with Manchester University has shown the real benefits in terms of supporting a better quality of life for people with dementia. But the challenge that we're discussing here today as a panel is very much how do you secure the funding for these types of services? And I'm in an unusual situation in that now I'm a service provider trying to persuade NHS and local government to part with money to invest in a community-based non-clinical service to promote health and well-being. But for most of my career, I've been within that healthcare system at national level as a strategy director and at regional level in Greater Manchester as a commissioner. And so I'm sort of like, is it gamekeeper turned poacher, I suppose, might be the analogy. And I think what Charlotte said is very relevant because I've used the analogy of imagine a GP referring you to hospital for an outpatient's appointment or treatment, and you go and you have that treatment, and then the hospital staff have to rattle a bucket at the end of the gateway to make sure that the hospital gets paid for seeing you. And sadly, we know the pressure of funding on the NHS is great, but this is the challenge of those of us in the voluntary community, social enterprise sector. We have interventions that we know can be hugely beneficial, but we have this challenge of persuading funders in the public sector, but other sectors as well, to invest in our model. And I think there are three very broad areas of challenge I'd briefly like to highlight. The first one, which Charlotte has eloquently defined, is personalisation. If we don't make it personal, then we fall into the trap of many clinical pathways of care that assume everybody with a certain condition needs exactly the same treatment and will have exactly the same progression, and it's just not like that. Social prescribing, by definition, is personalised around people's hopes, motivations, and what's going to work for them. The second area I would highlight is around the evidence and the data. So we need to collect data. We need to be able to demonstrate benefit, both for the individuals that we're supporting, but also for the wider healthcare system. So there's primary benefit in terms of improvements in health and well-being and quality of life, but secondary benefits. Will the healthcare system be more efficient as a result of it? Will it deflect resource away and demand away from busy, overpressed public services? And this is, I think, evidence, not only data in terms of numbers and analysis and research, which is vital, but also the human stories, the case studies, the powerful stories that show how we can transform people's lives. And finally, and I've come up across this a lot from within the healthcare system, the bureaucracy of the commissioning system. For those small voluntary organisations that really don't have the capacity to write complex bids or business cases, it can be hugely challenging. And it's also very much geared towards a level of evidence which can be quite hard to prove. So there is actually a huge amount of flexibility that public services have. For example, I know many NHS procurement managers are not aware that they can actually give uncompeted grants to local charities if they wish. It's perfectly legal to do that. But there's often a lack of awareness about procurement routes and investment routes that are open to public services. So for those of you in the provider landscape, I would say build your connections with your local commissioners. And part of the journey is not only showing them what you can offer in terms of your services, but also potentially educating them in how they can commission you. So that's my sort of opening perspective, Paul. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Giles. And Siobhan.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. My name's Siobhan Casey. I'm the work with AgeNI. We're the leading charity for older people in Northern Ireland. Our purpose is to help people thrive as they age, and we work both in terms of providing services, care and well-being and advice, policy support and voice, to make sure that older people's voices are heard across Northern Ireland in the local decision-making councils, but also at a regional level, which is a bit difficult because we don't have a government at the minute. But then to support older people's groups in places right throughout Northern Ireland. So that's around capacity building, understanding sustainability, and understanding impact and evaluation. Because I think what you just said there, it's, in terms of social prescribing, it's really important for charities and older people's groups to be able to demonstrate the impact that they make. Our work over the last sort of number of years has been, particularly around COVID, has been to support the mental and physical reconditioning of older people, because there's been a big impact, as you know, in terms of frailty and also in terms of deterioration in mental health and well-being. We're one of the recipients of the Innovate UK Design for Ageing bids. We had a programme called Move More, Live More, which looks not only at promoting the physical capability of older people, but also the living aspects in terms of nutrition, sleep, mental well-being, and connections. So that's been one of the elements of that, is to be to put in a social prescribing software into the actual programme, and which links out into all of the local community facilities around physical and mental well-being activity. So I think I would just echo the rest, what's been said here already. I mean, the issue is around funding for groups that are providing these vital activities in the community, and also capacity support in order to enable that kind of impact reporting and delivery of services and governance that's needed around that.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Siobhan. And finally, our final contributor at this point is Katie.
And the first thing I've got is a Slido poll. So I'd be really, what a day to have a frog in my throat, I'm so sorry. I'm really interested to know what you find the challenges are with finding funding. So if we have a look at the poll, and while that's running, I'm just going to give you a bit of an intro to social finance, if my voice comes back. So social finance is, if you haven't heard of us, is a not-for-profit organisation. And we really work as an intermediary organisation across socially minded investors, service providers, and government and statutory funders. So, we really see ourselves as working across those organisational boundaries and helping to bring people across those organisational boundaries to work together to think about doing things in a different way. And okay, so it's looking really interesting at the moment that funding for scaling up is the kind of most challenging area. And interestingly, pump priming and sustaining the service, about a third, and 20%, okay. And so I'll sort of tailor a little bit about what I talk about to some of those challenges. So for those of you who are not really familiar with social investment, there's a range of different kinds of social investment. And we're not the only players in the social investment sector. So there's a number of other organisations that do similar things to what we do at Social Finance. There's Big Society Capital that some of you will have heard of, Bridges and Big Issue Invest, and we're all working in a very sort of similar way to help bring kind of new funding to different ways of working. But some of social investment is going to be really familiar to you, because it's actually often grant funding is one of the things that can be done as a kind of social investment. And a different kind of funding might be repayable grants, but all the way through to some of the more riskier ventures might be venture capitalists might put money into some very, very, very innovative things working in very different ways. But social finance, we tend to work with major national charities and other very sympathetic investors to bring funding into the statutory sector and to think about different ways of working across some of the areas that you were all sort of talking about. And we've got priorities around dementia and older people's complex needs, end-of-life care, and also personalised care. So, different ways of funding that way of working. And I think I was badged here as talking about how to be successfully commissioned and sustained. And I think, first off, to say that I don't think we have a magic wand in social finance as to how you might do that. But one of the things that we would be focusing on is outcomes-based commissioning. And when you have a focus on impact and outcomes, you can really work to align priorities across those systems that you're working in and those organizational boundaries. So sympathetic investors and commissioners who might be able to take a risk in working differently. So, we might be able to, social investment can help work to reallocate funds across different parts of a health or social care system. So where you're looking to align an outcome in a community setting where it's helping to support a particular benefit, say reducing the number of people in hospital at the end of their life, for example. So, you're really being able to kind of pull a better outcome into the sector that you're looking to work in. And in building a case for impact, we really look to consider what those system stresses are that you are helping to solve in the services that you're providing. So, what is it that you're helping a system to achieve, and really aligning those priorities so where it can sit with the benefits that you're delivering for both the system that you're working in, but also the person for the service that you're delivering. Sits the context of any project within that system as a whole. And one of the things that we would also be doing as well is really sort of having a very flexible approach, so very much focused on the outcome rather than a particular service model. So if you're delivering a particular outcome for a system and you have a particular service model, how might that need to change when you're developing a new service to really keep that focus on that particular impact or outcome? And we're quite pragmatic around the economic value of any outcome that you're looking to achieve for a particular healthcare or social care intervention. What's the system want to pay for? And how can that be measured? We're quite relaxed working with systems around. We heard Chris Whitty talking about the challenges of data and what could be measured, and we're really keen to look for proxies and to be very pragmatic about what you can help a system demonstrate that the impact that something's being achieved. Again, looking for funding, the kind of funding that we provide is multi-year, and getting away from what we would call pilotitis. If you're doing lots of very small pilots that don't really have much opportunity to demonstrate their impact, we would be looking to allow people a longer time to develop and to really demonstrate that something is working for a system. The other thing as well is helping to get people to get their projects into a budget and into the bottom line, so that you can really demonstrate that something's having an impact, but also that it's being paid for as you go along. And finally, just to say that it might sound like the kind of work that we do in social investment, that you need social investment to be able to do some of these things, and we know that that's not necessarily the case. You can work on an impact and an outcomes basis with commissioners without having to have special funding to do that, and actually that's often a really good way to proceed. So yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Katie. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. And the good news is that I don't have a blank screen here. I have quite a lot of questions, which is great. I'm going to just try and sort of work my way, not just down the list, but around them a bit, because I think there's some quite useful themes that have been coming out. I think one of the first, just really is a good starting place, actually, and it partly picks up on the last point that Katie was talking about. And it's asking us to sort of cast our minds forward and envisage the future. And this is quite an ambitious question, because it talks by 2050, can we imagine a world in which social prescribing is an NHS-funded service? And the questioner means by that this funding pays for the service provider to deliver. So I guess I would just add to that, let's not just imagine, well, what might be the things that create the conditions that we get to that sort of environment? I'm going to sort of throw that at Charlotte and maybe Giles, and I'll be very happy to take other answers to that as well.
That's a really good question. I think obviously we don't have NHS England and Department of Health here on the panel, but when I talk to them about investment into social prescribing activities, i.e. the community provision rather than the link workers, there's almost an ideological resistance to the NHS paying for everything, in the sense that the NHS really is still very enshrined in the medical model, and is quite happy to pay for medical treatments, biomedical conditions. And even when Professor Chris was talking about prevention, he was talking about medical prevention, stopping people smoking, not necessarily reducing people's stress or helping people access arts and culture. So I think there's an ideological barrier that might make this never happen, but that's not to say that the NHS don't feel that they're a key anchor within a wider network of funders that would come together and jointly invest in community activities. So that could well include DCMS. So, for example, you might have heard that Sport England have just released this week funding of 250 million into their priority places, which are deprived areas, to help people who are not active and who typically have health conditions or in deprived areas to be more active. Well, how can we align funding like that with NHS funding, with social care funding, with philanthropic funding to support social prescribing activities? And I think that's probably the model we would hope to have in 20 years, because it's unlikely we will ever come to a world where the NHS is accountable, responsible and funding this provision, but really just seen as a core element of a shared funding around outcomes in the way that we've already talked about.
Thank you. Charles?
Yeah, I would definitely endorse that, Charlotte. I think it's unrealistic to think the NHS will be the sole funder of community-based interventions that promote health and well-being. It should be a contributor. Most charities and community organisations get funding from a variety of different sources, and I suspect that needs to continue that way. We wouldn't want to be a wholly commissioned NHS service, because what then happens is the NHS starts to set expectations about how you deliver that service, and actually the point about community-based services is that they've grown in those communities around what people need and want. I think there are, in addition to what Charlotte says, maybe some policy changes that perhaps an incoming government could take if it wanted to be really bold. So to give you an example, I would love to see a social value levy mandated on all public sector spending, even a tiny percentage, 1 or 2% of public sector spending. And by social value, for those that aren't familiar with the Social Value Act, it would mean effectively 3 things. 1, reinvestment in the local economy, so local health and care organisations, organisations delivering health and care benefit, but it would also need to be environmentally friendly and sustainable. It would also need to be invested in those community groups and organisations. And that would be a small percentage of big public sector budgets, even when they're under pressure, but it would provide regular seed corn funding for community groups and voluntary organisations locally to do wonderful things. And it would also stimulate a growing relationship between the NHS and voluntary sector, because I think often big public sector organisations like the NHS have got limited understanding of actually what's going on within their local communities. They're delivering their own services, they're under pressure, they're under the cosh, they're not necessarily looking outwards into those communities. And so therefore this type of innovation, I think, would need a bit of top-down pressure as well.
Siobhan, do you want to add anything?
You may know that in Northern Ireland, the Health and Social Care Trusts work to get, it's all one, it's not separate. So in the Northern Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland, the NHS, or the Northern Trust, has commissioned its own social prescribing contract, which AgeNI fulfills for it, and that is, it does appoint link workers, but part of the role in that is about identifying and supporting activities within the community and the capacity building that I spoke about earlier on, in terms of supporting those smaller groups that that we're prescribing out to, be it physical activity, mental support, just luncheon clubs, transport, whatever it is. Where the part of the work is to support them to become more sustainable, understand how they can themselves get more funding, and that would be the role of AgeNI and the link workers to do that. So we've probably moved on a wee bit further. I'm happy to say it's not 2050 and it's not ideal, but it's certainly going in the right direction. It's a really good service. We do about 600 people a year at the minute.
And Katie, I wanted to just follow on question about social finance, just to sort of, and if you want to pick up on the earlier question as well, that's great. But on social finance, 2 or 3 questions, lots of interest. One was, why is social investment not supporting enabling infrastructure that lifts the tide for all levelling up? So there's sort of an issue about how can social finance play a wider part in that sort of supporting infrastructure conversation. And then there's a piece around, let me just find the right questions, so many now, which is great. Is there a genuine interest from private investors in funding service providers beyond the basic corporate social responsibility mantra?
So yes, I think it's sometimes, it depends on which area you're working in. So we, in my line of work, we are often thinking about service provision. And so if you're saying funding infrastructure, That's not been where we've actually been coming from, but I don't think, it is actually quite a flexible form of funding, and it depends, it's the sort of thing, if you're going to develop an idea, you can go out and look for fundraising opportunities for people who are sympathetic, who are particularly interested in funding newer ways of working. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how it can also sort of support what I think is termed sort of the shift left to that sort of prevention agenda as well, because it can help to reallocate funding across a system, because you're demonstrating that sort of system benefit to a different part of the system. So you might be providing something in the community, but you're actually also able to point to other areas and say, well, actually, look, hospital, if we're doing this particular intervention here, we're helping to prevent people, coming to your front door or whatever it is that you're looking to help achieve. So I think that optimistically, looking to 2050 as well, I think that the way that the health and social care sector is being driven to kind of join up a little bit more, if I'm being very optimistic, I think that is, the NHS is being made to look out to the community sector and to the voluntary sector, and may have more incentive to do so in future and to think about different ways of working. And the second question was, what was it that you said?
It was about sort of the appetite of private investors to
private
in
investors,
this
yep.
space.
So yes, there is some appetite for private investors to be involved in this kind of work. It really is about alignment of values, we often say. So you're looking for people who are really wanting to drive a particular impact or change. So for example, you might be thinking about pension funds are really interested in helping people to stay well, or banks might be looking to really work with people who are, for example, bereaved, to give them better outcomes. They do have different kind of aspects of work that they're really interested in funding, and it tends to be aligned to the work that they're doing as well. So yes, there is appetite there from private investors to work in this kind of space. Again, from our perspective, we'd be talking about the alignment of values across the space that we're working in. So you've got to work with people who think alike to make it work.
Thank you. And I just wanted to reflect on the answers and just give a perspective as someone who chairs an integrated care board in England. And one of the things that, with their being established as statutory organisations last year, was a real emphasis from NHS England about establishing new networks with the community and voluntary sectors. And in my system's case, we have a community, voluntary, faith and social enterprise alliance that covers the whole of our system, and they are on the ICB board, not just as people with a token voice, but actually with a vote. And in some of our most recent discussions, where we were discussing the usual pressures on the NHS in terms of the front door A&E pressures, it was really refreshing and really important that we had a voluntary sector voice in the conversation, because they moved the conversation to being, well, why are the people coming through the door? And one of the drivers, significant amount of A&E attendance, actually is debt, financial poverty, financial issues, and therefore issues around investing in debt support and so on really came through as a theme, which changes the conversation within the ICB about how it allocates its resources. Absolutely take the point that we're not going to see the NHS pick up the whole bill, but there is a significant reason why the NHS should. So I just sort of throw that into the conversation as well. Yeah. And just wonder how social finance might play a part in that as well, going forward.
I think it's about, from our perspective, we would be thinking very much about helping to demonstrate that benefit, exactly as you said, because often the NHS, as it traditionally has been set up, wouldn't think outside its own doors about how if you're going to invest in something, it would think, well, we need to have a particular service that's run in a particular way. But, you've just illustrated that point really nicely about if you had a service that was helping people who have a debt problem, the benefit, and so the organisation that might want to pay for that service actually might be the NHS. But traditionally, they wouldn't look outside their door because that's not a health service, it's not a medical model, but actually you're helping them to think about their priorities. What do they really need? Well, they don't want people at the emergency department front door that don't need to be there. And so it's about helping align that priority so it can be paid for by the system.
Now, I've got another question here which I'd like to ask, which is really, I think, keen to get advice about what's the route that might be taken to get into a conversation with the Commissioner at a local level. So this is as a very small organisation with limited resources, time and money, what's recommended as the best route to exploring social prescribing as a route for them to actually get their service, their product adopted. So I'd be interested, Charlotte, to get your perspective, maybe Giles, and I'll see if others want to come in as well.
Well, I think you've already answered the question there, in that the voluntary and community sector alliances are in every integrated care partnership. So the model that you've described should be happening everywhere in England. And actually, there should be, underneath that alliance, some further infrastructure. There are often councils for voluntary service. They're known as infrastructure organisations for the voluntary and community sector. And they'd be a really good place to start, because not only could they advise on the ICPs, the integrated care partnership, and the NHS locally, their priorities, their structures, the opportunities. They're likely to be aware of, for example, health inequality funding that comes from NHS England to those local systems that is available to support local voluntary organisations that are addressing health inequalities. So I would say contact your local council for voluntary service, and you can find those on the NAVCA website. NAVCA is the national body for those organisations, and they should be able to guide local providers to the alliances, to those representatives that are on the board, and give people a voice. Now, it's not perfect, but it's leagues away from where we were 5 years ago, when most voluntary organisations had very limited voice with local authorities and with health systems at a senior level, and where the infrastructure was less robust. It's actually a statutory requirement under the Health and Care Act 2022 that integrated care boards relate to their voluntary sector providers and have these alliances. So although they're bedding in, they should be available and people should be able to access them.
Thank you. Giles?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Contact your local CVS, certainly. I would also say try and work out the structure of your local commissioners. And that can be challenging, I agree. But not just those who actually commission the services, but those who are involved in things like social prescribing. So there will now be social prescribers or link workers, usually attached to your GP practices, but often based in CVSs and other community organisations. Then there will be health and wellbeing advisors or officers or equivalent roles funded by local authorities. Try and find out who these people are in your area and invite them along to what your service is. Get them to see what you do and build a relationship with them, because then you've got advocates within that system. I think commissioners, and I speak from personal experience here, can be very risk averse. You know, there are no rewards for taking a punt on an innovative service when you're managing public money. In actual fact, it can be quite career limiting to take a chance and find that actually something didn't work out, and suddenly you're being asked to answer why you've wasted X amount of public money on commissioning a service that didn't really deliver. So therefore, commissioners instinctively can be quite risk averse. You've got to find out who they are, build the relationship with them, try to get them to understand what it is you offer, and be prepared to start small, with small short-term contracts, and build that relationship. Because I don't think there's any real expectation that they'll suddenly commission a completely new service at scale. But in the changing landscape of ICBs, Paul, and CCGs, you know, kind of going, it can be quite hard for people just to find who's actually now the decision maker about local investment. So, you know, find out who's doing that in your local system and try and build relationships, I would say, with the commissioner and public sector side, as well as with the CVS.
Yeah. Other contributions?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, you know, if we're obviously would be talking about older people, and in the Northern Ireland perspective, we would always be encouraging, you know, smaller organisations to get in touch with us to be able to help and guide, as well as their community and voluntary, you know, sector colleagues. I think across England, there's 130 Age UKs, and if that can be, you know, be a good point of reference to start off with.
I'd really second your a kind of networking idea. And I think when we have an expression of interest and we get people coming to us asking for funding, I'm often saying, okay, who do you know in your local system? And if people have made that connection, made that networking opportunities, that often makes things a lot easier because you're a bit of a known quantity. The other way I've sometimes thought about it is if you've got an idea, who can say no to your idea and go make friends with the person who can say no, because you're going to have to get them on board at some point. They're often the people in the finance teams as well. So commissioners, but also your local finance person is often key because these are the people that are ultimately going to be making the decision on how the money gets spent.
And I would absolutely endorse the point about really working out the infrastructure that's now being set up in terms of the CVFSE alliances, because that creates a new route, a new way of forming those relationships and actually having those conversations. And telling the stories, actually, as Giles said, is that making the connection and not seeing this as a transactional thing. This is about building and sustaining a relationship to get from that position where you're having the initial seed funding that might get something off and prove the concept or demonstrate to a commissioner that it's worth putting the money in, but actually then moves to the position where you can actually say, well, this is something that needs to be mainstreamed. So just wanted to come on to another area. Several questions have been asked in the audience around, well, how do we know? How do we evaluate? How do we demonstrate benefit? I mean, there's various themes on that. Obviously, in the NHS context, there's an awful lot of evaluation of medical interventions, and there's, through our NICE and other processes, quite a lot of stuff that's put around that in terms of pharmacology as well. But a really interesting the impact of social interventions of one sort or another. And I'm going to start with Katie because obviously social finance driven around outcomes. So how do you create the frameworks? What sort of frameworks are relevant to you?
So we would be thinking very much about what is, excuse me, the benefit to the system and what are they prepared to invest in. So, for example, we had a project that was around loneliness. So again, not a kind of medical intervention, and they were really interested in ratings of loneliness. There were evidence-based interventions around loneliness and self-rating around the person who was receiving that service, rating themselves at the beginning of an intervention, at the end point of the intervention, and later down the line. And that was something that the local area that we were working with was prepared to invest in. So there was an outcome repayment given back to the social investor at different points of the process. And so, again, if you've got a kind of an area where you can point to some evidence for an intervention, it doesn't have to be a very immediate economic benefit. We can really talk to systems in the work that we do around a notional economic benefit. So, what is the system really interested in supporting? And, I think often now, especially with the development of the ICSs, they're really prepared to look at slightly broader outcomes, not necessarily just things that you can traditionally would have seen as having a kind of a money element attached to it. So, again, talking to your local system, what do they need to prioritise? What are their longer term aims and objectives? And see if you can attach a value to that as part of your kind of conversations that you're having.
And Giles, as a former commissioner, I mean, from your perspective, when you were a commissioner, what sort of approaches would you have taken to sort of demonstrate the realisation of benefit?
I think the first thing on the financial side, and this might seem a bit controversial, but I would advise don't claim you're going to save the NHS a lot of money, because they won't believe you. What I would say, and this is jargon and it's not really the right language, but it's the language they use, it's about deflecting demand. So if you imagine what Chris Whitty was talking about, and we've got this ageing population and demand for public services is increasing exponentially every year, yet funding is flatline, which if you allow health service funding I'm talking about here, if you allow for inflation means it's actually in reality a real terms cut. That gap is getting wider every year. And so what you're not going to realistically be able to do is take money out, take cashable savings out of the healthcare system, because they're still going to need more doctors, more nurses, more allied health professionals. But what you can potentially demonstrate is if you support people in the community with their health and well-being, they are less likely to go to the GPs, they are less likely to be admitted to hospital, they are less likely to need as many prescription medications, etc. The last social prescribing study I was on, we were able to demonstrate a 40% reduction in GP appointments for people that were supported. What that means is you're releasing valuable clinical time to spend with patients who really need that. So I would focus on those kind of arguments from the sort of financial side, but what I wouldn't forget and where I would start is the difference you make to real people's lives. So the human element, the human stories, the power of what we've been trying to demonstrate here with Music in Mind is it's hugely emotional. It can transform people's lives. It gets people with dementia out of their homes and into the community. It provides respite for their husbands and wives who become their full-time carers. So actually, you build up a kind of, if you like, group of people that understand what you're trying to do. And there are advocates, there are people within local government, within the NHS, within the healthcare system, who recognise the challenges that Chris was talking about and know that they need to do things differently, and they will be looking and open-minded to great examples. So you've got to win the hearts first, but you've also got to then be able to back that up with a bit of a business case. And even if you don't have the data and the evidence yourself, at least suggest to them, well, how would we work together to collect some evidence and start to make the case?
And just picking up on that, you talked about outcomes-based accountability, and, sometimes that can be very daunting for smaller organisations to pick that up. But I think it's to be encouraging around finding out exactly what it is, the difference, or even the commissioners want made, so if it's like for us, depending on the service, it could be well-being, it could be loneliness scores, it could be for our Move More, Live More, it's falls efficacy scores, but there's standardised measurements out there that commissioners understand, and if you take the time to figure out which are the ones that are most relevant, then that's what you're going to measure, how people feel at the beginning of the service and how they feel afterwards, and I do know how daunting it can be, and because it's very difficult to demonstrate, the savings to the healthcare system or, other kind of, other reductions. It's very difficult to get, people to do this social return on investment analysis or the health economics analysis. But, I think starting out with what's the difference you want to make to people? What do the commissioners understand in terms of, and what do they expect in terms of assessments? Then it's, what did we do? How well did we do it? And what difference did it make? And that's the three elements that people are asked in the outcomes-based accountability.
Yep. Charlotte, did you want to add anything at all?
Yes, just to say this is a really important area for my organisation, which is the National Academy for Social Prescribing. We have a small team of academic evidence experts, and they really focused on driving the quality of research and evidence. And we've just published a review of the economic impacts of social prescribing. So if you take a look at our website, which is socialprescribingacademy.org.uk, click on the evidence section, you can find 15 different evidence reviews. But as I say, this one being, I think, our most important. And what it does is it has reviewed about 26 different evaluations and research studies that focused on the economic benefits or the economic impact. And it looks at different methodologies, so social return on investment, system and demand reduction, and it tries to draw conclusions around this. Now, there's still a lot to be done, but what we have found is that evidence is becoming increasingly robust. I think the key point, as has been mentioned, is that so much energy is going into demonstrating demand reduction and economic benefits in every single integrated care system and with hundreds of voluntary organisations. What we need to be able to do is find the operating processes, the programs and systems that are robust and replicable enough that it gives assurance to those commissioners that if you implement in this way according to this approach, these are the savings that you are likely to generate, so that we avoid so many different local areas and organisations trying to invent the wheel, basically. And actually, there should be, there should be ways of doing it that are academically robust enough to provide assurances to finance directors and commissioners that if you operate a service in a particular way, it will lead to these savings. And we know, for example, that postural stability, falls prevention exercise programs for older people based on the FAME and Otago exercises, they're 36-week programs, that actually, if they're deployed according to the program, the evidence is they do reduce falls. And actually, the evidence there is robust enough that Public Health England, as it was at the time, have been able to produce really useful commissioning tools for commissioners that will say, you know, input this amount of money here in the programme, you get this money out the other end. And I think we need to be working much more smartly to design those sorts of business case templates and tools that can be then deployed in local areas to prevent this real wasted effort of everybody trying to do this, because it is unbelievably hard to do.
Yeah, and certainly I would echo that as an ICB chair. I think avoiding having to reinvent the wheel multiple times is incredibly important to the success of the whole idea of integrated care systems. One of the other sort of examples I came across about 2 or 3 years ago was a piece of work published by the All-Party Group on Arts and Health. Mm-hmm. They published a really seminal piece of work, really bringing together a wealth of the research base that already existed for arts-based interventions to improve or maintain health. So again, I think sometimes it's not that there isn't evidence, it's that we don't necessarily even start to look for the evidence that already exists. So I would certainly encourage that. So we're now in the last 2 or 3 minutes of this session. And I think, as I said, the key thing in this whole discussion is how the best advice you can give to an audience of people who are looking to find ways to get the door open and start the conversation. We've had some of the advice about building the relationships, but if you are not someone who is involved in the voluntary sector in an area, might be coming very much from a social enterprise perspective in terms of what you're trying to establish, how do you begin to build the opportunity to launch an initiative in an area when there isn't already the evidence base to support it? Just be interested to get some tips and tricks, things you have seen work in your own working lives that might be useful for people to hear today. I'm just going to go along the row, so I'm starting with Charlotte, and we'll get a few quick thoughts from each of you.
I think for me, having said, you know, let's not reinvent the wheel around data, it's gathering data. And what I would recommend is to go to the ONS website, where you will see different robust and well-used measures of data. And one is called ONS4, and it's the well-being measure. And it asks about life satisfaction, life worthwhileness, happiness, and anxiety. And it's a measure used in over 100,000 surveys a year. So if you are using that measure with your clients, you are using something that is academically robust and transferable, but also you can benchmark that data against the ONS website. So you can go on that website, you can look at your local town, and it will tell you the average score for, say, an older person in your local town. My area is Maidstone, and it is, say, 6.7 for happiness. Using that data is very simple, because it's a measure that you can ask clients, you know, most clients in a welcome way as part of talking to them and joining them into the service. And you measure that 3 months later. And if your service is effective, you should have moved them on one of those measures over that 3 or 6 month period. And that's the sort of data that is manageable, easy to collect, and which commissioners will look at as a positive indicator that you understand data, you understand that you need to have an impact and a demonstrable impact, and that they can then benchmark and align to other things. All social prescribing link workers should be collecting that data. So that data is already flowing into health systems. And so I think that's probably the easiest thing that you could do.
Great, thank you very much. Giles.
I would say it was the third of my initial opening points. Understand the funding mechanisms that apply. So if you're a social enterprise or a not-for-profit that's looking to get a foot in the door and looking to get started in a relationship with local NHS or public services, and by definition you don't have an established track record or data, then look for innovation funding, talk the language of pilots. So obviously there's UKRI, but organisations, and it might be philanthropic trusts or others, that are prepared to take a bit of a risk on a new idea or an innovation that isn't yet proven. And then, you know, as I say, councils tend to get this better than the NHS, but they can invest through grants. Grants as a mechanism are meant to be about innovation, not a contractual sort of, you know, produces X many widgets in Y many years or whatever. But as I say, you sometimes frankly need to educate the commissioners on that and say, look, I've got this really great idea. I've got other potential funders are interested, but you've got to be prepared to talk the language of pilots. And as part of that piloting, you would be gathering some evidence to prove bigger scaling and sustainability. And I think just as an adjunct to that, be prepared to build partnerships as well. That if you actually get others from related or similar sectors on side and you're going with a proposition that's got some momentum behind it, you'll be taken more seriously.
Great, thank you. Giles. Siobhan.
I suppose I've always been coming from the, you know, the grassroots organisations and people on the ground who know where the gaps are and who know what's needed in communities. And I think there's lots of good organisations out there doing good things, but they know what's not happening. So as well as the bigger, higher level data, it's really the touch points on the ground that will be able to give initial feedback on whether an idea is good or not or needed in that particular place.
I think it's all, you know, all of the above, and you're building a case for impact, aren't you? And then when you are approaching a statutory funder, what's going to make them say yes? You know, and do they have a particular criteria that, you know, a successful investment case might look like? And, you know, again, if you've built that kind of, you've got that, both the sort of, the data you know that they need to approve a business case, but also that kind of grassroots, real demonstration of impact. And then it's suddenly obvious to them that it's not a nice to have, it's something that they need to be doing. And yeah, that's been my tip.
Great. So we've had some really good advice there. I hope that's been useful to colleagues. I think we've heard how the NHS has created an infrastructure, creating a demand to be able to prescribe a whole range of social interventions. But now we need to make sure we are using all the levers that are available to actually ensure that the supply is really there in the volume that's needed and that there are new ways in which people can deliver those services. I want to, in a moment, just thank our panel, but also just need to say that as we come to the close of this session, those of you who are here in person, we're going to be having teas, coffees and so on in the Duchy Suite upstairs, I think that is. And I believe there's another opportunity to sample the music as well. And those of you who are joining us virtually today, there is apparently a digital coffee table available for you and others to share some fellowship in that virtual way. So please do put your hands together to show your appreciation of our panel.